So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my creative process. But first, I have a confession to make. I'm a failure. My failures outnumber my successes by a ridiculous margin. I fail at programming. I fail at anti-aliasing. And I fail at keeping my mouth shut. And it's kind of funny. I'm not the biggest Zelda fan in the room, I'm sure. But 3 of my slides today are Zelda references. I don't know how that happened. So, sure, Mint, Fever, and to a lesser extent, The Last Rocket have been successful. But they're kind of the culmination of a process full of failures, of some tiny and not so tiny failures. So today I'm going to fail at hiding my failures from you. But first, some context. I grew up in suburban apartment complexes. I had a BMX, some Transformers, 4 Ninja Turtles, and an NES. The 80s were awesome. My father worked at a video rental store, which also rented games. And I didn't have a lot of games, but it worked out. One of the the largest purchase I ever made as a kid was a Super Nintendo. I must have saved for a year to get this thing, this $200 console. And so in the afternoon it came out, we went down to Toys R Us and we waited in line and we got it. And I hadn't accounted for sales tax, so I failed at that. And my parents had to help me out. And this is the gorgeous Japanese and Australian and, well, I guess PAL region Super Nintendos, and the US one is hideous, so I didn't bother pixeling it up. And so, as children, we fail a lot, and we fall down a lot. And it's funny, when you think about walking is basically just like controlled falling forward. You just kind of you lean forward and then you stick a leg out in front of you, you hope that you catch yourself. If you don't do that, if you try to walk without falling forward, it's kind of awkward. You look like those robots that they're trying to get to walk properly. You got to like squat your legs and then stick one leg out and then transfer your weight over it. It's a little weird. But what's interesting about walking is that falling is both a precursor to learning to walk and the first step in the process. And I tend to equate failing and falling. They're very similar. So a lot of my projects have scratched sort of my own itch. There's something about solving a problem that you personally have that gives you a focus and a drive that solving someone else's abstract problem doesn't. And so with Mint, I was curious. Mint satisfied a curiosity about where visitors to my site were coming from, what pages they were looking at, what search terms they were using to find it. But Mint actually wasn't my first attempt at a web stats program. I wrote a simple script called ShortStat, simple PHP script. And where that failed was it didn't account for like a scaling database. So all this data was being dumped into a database, and if you just let it run, it would just fill up and fill up and fill up, and your site would just slow to a crawl. And so I started working on a second version of ShortStat that tried to address that by normalizing the database so there wasn't duplicate data anywhere in the database. And that slowed the growth, but didn't really help. That kind of failed. And there was also a problem with referrer spam because it was all just pulling refers from the server global object in the PHP environment. And that's where they usually get you. And so Mint was sort of a reaction to the failures of those two products, where I wanted to have the database, it would expire after 5 weeks or once it hits like a limit of 25 megabytes. And it did 2 things. It kept the database size down and allows you to always have like fresh, relevant data to look at in your stats. And then with Fever, Fever solved the problem of condensing hours worth of feed reading into a few minutes. What Fever does is it looks at your links. It looks at all the links that are embedded in the articles in your feeds, and it figures out which ones are being linked to most prominently, and it bubbles them up to the top. But Fever started as an application called Periodicals, which really didn't solve any problems. Basically, all it did was allowed the feed host to specify a custom CSS file that would style the feed's title and the item or the article titles in the feed and articles lists of the feed reader to look like the spine of a magazine. And then you could see all your unread items as a stack of unread magazines, and all that really did was overwhelm you. And so Fever kind of evolved from that. I built an app called Noises, which is a classic video game chiptune-like soundtrack player. And it came from a desire to be able to listen to classic chiptunes on the go on my iPod without filling up my music library with gigs and gigs and gigs of music. So it actually plays the file formats that the consoles themselves play. And it came from being a failure at sitting still. I created Noises while my second game, Horror Vacui 2, was waiting for a review in the App Store. And it has a sound test in it, and the sound in all my games is run off of an emulated NES sound chip. And so I already had the code, and I ripped it out, and I, through trial and error, got some core data hooked up in the back end, and recreated basically the music player or the iPad app, but for chiptunes. And eventually, I got tired with doing web development. I got a little bored, and I didn't feel like I was challenging myself anymore. And one morning, I had an epiphany that over the years, I had accumulated sort of a competency in 3 of the core disciplines of game design. Not the only disciplines, and maybe not even the most important discipline, but design, programming, and music. And I just thought, hey, I could do this. I could start small. And I guess, this is another Zelda thing with the Triforce. If I were to extend this metaphor, I guess the silver arrow that you need to kill Ganon would be game design as the actual, the core competency of game design. And so at the beginning of 2011, an Australian band contacted me. They were releasing a new single, and they wanted someone to produce an 8-bit game to help promote it in the App Store. And they had great credentials. The music was good. They listed like some of my favorite 8 and 16-bit games as references. But having only created a couple of small games in the off hours for maybe like a week or a month, I didn't know how to schedule or even charge. I didn't know what was involved in the process. So I set out on a 30-day project to create an iPhone game, and 140 days later I was done. So I kind of fail at budgeting the time there. There were things like, I don't even think I accounted for level design, and it was a level-based game. And that's a huge chunk of what you do. So a lot of my ideas come from, or the genesis of my ideas are when I'm doing something mundane, like falling asleep at night or waking up in the morning, taking a shower, or going to the grocery store. My first game, Horror Vacui, which is like a fear of white space, came to me as I was falling asleep one night, and I jotted some notes down. I woke up to these notes about earth and water and these 2 elements at different temperatures and how they interact with each other. And it was around the time that Apple released the iPhone SDK, before it was even the iOS SDK. And around that time, the Wii homebrew community had figured out how to jailbreak Wii's. And so my first game was actually just simple turn-based abstract strategy board game. It's kind of a mouthful. It's kind of like Othello meets rock, paper, scissors. And it was cool because they give you a Zelda save file. Again, Zelda, jeez. They give you the save file, and then you load it up on your Wii, and then you talk to some guy, and then like Matrix code rains down, and then all of a sudden you get the homebrew channel once it reboots. And they provide all these tool chains, and I just got it up and running in C. And then within the next month, because of the tools that Apple had provided, I was able to port my first game, like ever. Like I'd never dealt with an update loop before. Like web design is a request, and it lives. All the code lives for the duration of that request, and then it dies until the next request, and it's a whole other thing. But it was really cool that Apple provided these tools that allowed you to take something that simple and learn it that quickly and have a game in the App Store like a month later. So when I get into a new project, I tend to jump right in and start pushing pixels or sketching in code. And I have this thing that I call the couch test. My wife and I are both designers. And a couple of years ago, we were looking for a couch. And couch is a piece of furniture. The most important thing is that it's comfortable, right? But as designers, and as it's this huge honking piece of furniture sitting in the middle of your living room, you want it to look good. And so by jumping into pushing pixels or sketching in code, up front I get a feel for whether or not this idea is feasible or going to hold my interest for the duration of the entire project. And so when I talk about sketching in code, what I mean is I come from a web background. PHP, JavaScript are very concise languages. Objective-C is not. And so when I was trying to figure out the animation for The Last Rocket's credits screen, where Flip is flying through space and he's flying in a figure eight, I wanted something a little bit less heavy to kind of test out and perfect that algorithm, which ended up being really simple, without having all those, like the compile time and the syncing to the devices. And so I tend to go for whatever tool I'm most familiar with when I'm working on a project. And then through the course of the project, design leapfrogs programming, and programming leapfrogs design, and then missing is the music frog. He's off screen chilling. But then eventually, I hit like a roadblock, and everything's going good. You're creative, you're in the flow, you're not self-editing, but like these doubts are building up in the back of your mind. And while I was developing The Last Rocket, I maintained a developer diary where I would just write down whatever I was feeling or what I had worked on that day and things that I might need to do the next day. And on day 72, that's only halfway through what the project ended up being. I threw my hands up in the air and I'm like, I'd almost rather have this as a failure behind me than this cloud hanging overhead. It felt like the end of the world, like the end of the creative work. And what I realized through maintaining this developer diary is that every creative project I've undertaken has had one, if not multiple, moments like this where it feels like, okay, I can't move forward. But then, you turn the page in the developer diary and there's day 73 and I'm just jamming on some problem that I had and it just moved forward for another 60, 70 some odd days. But that's good. You want to have that self-doubt and that constant sort of like course correction as you're going. You're identifying these failures and addressing them as you go, and you're creating a solid foundation so that the rest of everything else that comes later has something solid and firm to stand on. Eventually, though, you might encounter a problem that seems intractable and you just need to unplug. And the way I do that is there's this thing called Ludum Dare or Ludum Dare, depending on who you talk to. And for those who don't know, it's a 48-hour solo game development competition where you're given a theme on a Friday night, and by Sunday night, you have 48 hours to work by yourself to make a game. And what I found, these dares are really rejuvenating. Like they break your focus, they let you focus on something else, but your mind is still like working in the background on that problem. And then you learn and discover new things that you can then pull back into your current project. And this guy right here is Milanaut. And in addition to the Ludum Dare, the 48-hour thing, there's also a jam where you have multiple people. And so all this artwork is actually done by Nevin Mergen, who spoke yesterday during the design mini-conf. Okay, so I tend to keep very small lists when I'm working. I don't like big lists. I find it's really easy to become overwhelmed in trying to solve problems that you haven't anticipated yet. And so I keep these small lists. I have a couple boulders, which are like the big ticket, broad stroke items that I'd like to achieve. And then I have the smaller rocks, which are like immediately actionable items. And then I work on smashing those rocks into sand, and then I chip a few more rocks off the boulders. And then I go until everything is just sand, and I'm just chilling in the sand. And then I tend to repeat that process. And yeah. And so then how do you know when you're done? And for me, I know when I'm done when there's no more, there's no big items, nothing that I'm like snagging my clothes on. No, no real points of pain in the interface and stuff. And so the thing with failure is that failure is only failure if it's allowed to stand as the last step in the process. But if you can identify that failure, learn from it and adapt to it and catch yourself and correct, then it's not the end of the world or the creative work. And that's me.